Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We are thrilled to have photographer David Arky as tonight's guest speaker. Based in New York, David is best known for his innovative approach to still life, conceptual and X-ray images. Aside from photographic services, he and his team also provide clients with concepts, sketches, set and prop design, and retouching as well. Clients include American Express, AT&T, Coach USA, Comcast, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, Levi Strauss, Microsoft, New Balance, Samsung, AARP, Forbes Magazine, Men's Health, Newsweek, New York Times Magazine, among many others. So please help me welcome David Arky to our lecture series.
Thank you. I've been a photographer for as long as I can remember. Jaime asked me how long I've been in New York. I moved here in the mid-1970s. And like many of you, I went to college. I went to RIT in Rochester. I went to Art Center College in Los Angeles. And on a fateful trip from Los Angeles to New York, a classmate of mine persuaded me that we should come to New York and open a photographic studio, which I had no idea what I was in store for. But somewhere along the way on our drive, he persuaded me that that was a good idea. So we visited a friend who had a loft right around here, and he said, oh yeah, you get a loft and you just kind of set up and you're in business. Well, my friend and I rented a loft. The landlord, didn't really want to know that we were living there. That was a sort of, unwritten rule. You could live here illegally, but he didn't want to know about it. And we started taking pictures. Before that, probably when I was about 8 years old, I developed my first roll of film, took my first photographs, and I think I was hooked ever since. And in high school, I worked on the school paper and school yearbook. And when we landed in New York, the luck of our move was that there was somebody living a couple floors below us in this loft building who was an assistant art director for a magazine. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it was a popular humor magazine at the time called the National Lampoon. And it was, in the 1970s, they were in their heyday. They were selling about 1 million copies a month. And so they had a budget to create art. And in one of my first meetings, I went to their offices on Madison Avenue, and the art director told me that, oh, we'd like you to take these photographs for us. And I really had no idea about, what to do, what to expect, but somehow we muddled through. There I am. Right? And this was the first photograph that we took for the National Lampoon. And I think, ultimately these experiences sort of formed a lot about, what I would do over the next couple of decades. The art director said they wanted to do a book about, the bicentennial of our country. They wanted us to find 7 models that we would paint and photograph in the studio. I remember borrowing an 8x10 view camera, borrowing strobes, asking everybody I knew if they knew somebody who would be in this photograph. So the rest was history. I was very much attracted to still life photography right from the get-go. Probably like many of you, I photographed landscapes, I did portraits, I did, all kinds of things, but I've always come back to the idea of still life. And, for me, a lot of these pictures are what I would consider today kind of concept-driven still lives. Basically it's about work. There was a model maker who created a life mask. We had to get the grinding wheel and a hand model whose hands were down there. That might have been my partner John at the time. And make these photographs. Probably most of these were done on a large format camera, pre-retouching, or if there was any retouching, we would turn the images over, to the magazine and really not have a lot to do with them. I probably, in those days, didn't have a lot to say about what the composition was, what the idea was. The art directors pretty much drove the idea, told us that they'd want to execute it, and it was up to us to figure out how to do that. You know, my guess is we probably did 2 different transparencies, one of the arrow and a target, and another of a model with the tattoo and the blood dripping down it that they combined together. You know, not my concepts, but I think it was really interesting to kind of figure out how to execute them. So after this, after the 1970s, I started to work for a lot of magazine publishers, a lot of book publishers, and what I did for the next couple decades was a little bit more mundane. I had a family to raise. I took a lot of photographs of computers and technology. Personal computers were becoming a very big industry, so those were the kinds of things that I did to make a living. Somewhere around 2005, you know, I'd been continuing to do a lot of editorial work, and in 2005, I got an assignment from Men's Health magazine, a photo editor there, and the story was about how the body processes sugars. So they didn't really have an idea, they didn't really have a sketch, and I just decided that I'd, you know, ask the photo editor, Don Kinsella, if he could send me the article, if he could send me the story for me to read, which up to then I think I was very intimidated about. I thought, okay, it's my job to take the photograph. It's the sort of photo editor, art director's job to kind of come up with the visual. So I took this photograph, which I think is pretty straightforward, but for me it changed a lot about how I saw my relationship, you know, to photography. I did some sketches. I was thinking about, you know, what is that idea of us processing, you know, and what is it that makes the body process sugar, what makes somebody diabetic, and I thought about this idea of a light switch. I turned to somebody, a model maker who I've been using for years, somebody who has a master's in sculpture. That was her entry into the field of model making. She's used to working with clay and plastics and steel and all kinds of materials. So I basically told her my idea. I don't remember if I had a sketch to share with her, but that was the idea. And she made for me a couple of different ones. She used different size sugar cubes and, you know, presented them to the photo editor, and this is what, you know, what they ran. So it really changed a lot for me after that I all of a sudden had the power to be able to talk to the client, you know, in a more intelligent way and say, gee, I've got some ideas too. What do you think about this for the story? You know, I proceeded to do other stories for them. These were all for Men's Health. This was a kind of a simple picture that I just did one day. I just really liked the textures. I liked the simplicity of it. And I've never quite understood why, but somehow people responded to it in my portfolio, and I got a couple of jobs after this. I'm not, you know, it's difficult to predict, I think, sometimes what motivates people to hire you, to commission you after seeing your work. I did this story for the cover of Newsweek about the, I think the title was The Dinner Divide, basically how the 2 different halves of America eat. Model maker, in this case, probably was the same person that also was the food stylist. You know, if you have questions along the way about what these different roles are, please feel free to ask me. But, you know, to me, a model maker is somebody who goes, well, a prop stylist is someone who usually goes and sources props. That same person could often like cut them up, you know, cut the plate up. That they could also be the food stylist. They would find the pizza, find the food to prepare. You know, sometimes if the picture, the story was more complex, there'd be a food stylist involved too. But a lot of those roles are somewhat interchangeable. But I think, you know, a long time ago I realized that it's not about, you know, me standing in a garret with an easel and a paintbrush and just working on my own. It's a very collaborative process. You know, a lot of things just come out of experimentation. I really didn't have any particular agenda with this. You know, I talked to the prop stylist. We got some things. I was thinking, you know, about something environmental and obviously something green, and just did a series of photographs around that idea. We'll get to my X-ray photographs in a little bit, but this was an assignment for a fitness magazine, and I think that they wanted to have me, commission me to do an X-ray photograph for this story, but it seemed like the way to make feathers, I think, more clear, more believable, was to take a photograph of them and composite them as a, you know, conventional image. You know, just lots of experiments with things that I like, my assistant likes, he's an avid bicyclist, and just somehow we were thinking about, you know, images that are graphic, things that we'd both like to work on. I think the title of this series was The Bike of the Future. The bulk of my work takes place in the studio. I'd say maybe 95% of it. Every now and then, you know, I get sent to a location, which can be fun. I think it was about, you know, 45 degrees in this warehouse that was a data processing center in New Jersey. And often I'm just asked to photograph beautiful objects and kind of make them, you know, bold and graphic as well. And there's no particular concept involved other than to make a nice illustration. This was for Forbes magazine. Things seem to go in series in a way. I did this photograph for Popular Science. The story was about a world grain shortage, and I think it was an interesting challenge. You know, I would often meet with my prop stylist well in advance or over the phone, talk about how we're going to solve this problem, how are we going to build the map out of grain, and you know, make it look accurate. Yeah, this was part of the same story as well. So in this case, the prop stylist really just took a frame, drilled some holes into it, and turned it into an abacus. This was another piece for Fitness magazine. It really was a story about cancer, and this is a photograph. This is the version that I did for my portfolio. Here, I think the dilemma was figuring out, you know, what's the best way to do this? You've got, the lungs were about 4 feet tall. You know, do we use real flowers? How do we create an armature to support the structure? And it turns out Kelly, my prop stylist, made a structure out of foam, sculpted it, and used artificial daisies to give the prop some support, and we suspended it in the studio. We talked about using real flowers, but by the time it would go from her place in Brooklyn to my studio, they all would have wilted. And I think, you know, for the purposes of the image, at the end of the day, it's all about, you know, the final product, whether we use real flowers or not is sort of is immaterial. And in the final, there were these daisies that were sprayed black, which was, you know, talking about some of the dangers of smoking. For a while, I had a lot of fun working for the UK version of Wired. They sent me up to MIT, to the Media Lab, and they did an annual issue which was about some of the students there who were, you know, young scientists developing projects, and this was a do-it-yourself cell phone kit. But, you know, I've always loved photographing technology. It's just something that speaks to me, and I really, you know, like, it's personal. I take it to heart. I really want to make a beautiful image. These days, I think almost every photograph, I take involves some computer enhancement. I want to do as much on the camera as possible, but quite often, clients will have a request for the background. You might shoot it on gray and they really want it to be blue. So it's an inevitability that you have to plan the photograph around giving the client, some degree of flexibility. This was a wonderful object that changed shape as you changed the gesture of your hand. As you brought your hands closer to this object, it would expand and contract. And this object on the right is one of the prototypes that this great researcher at MIT has spent his whole life working on. He lost his limbs in a climbing accident when he was in his teens and went on to develop a whole series of artificial limbs at the Media Lab there. So this was for the Boston Globe, and again, it was a little bit of some prop styling, some computer enhancement. The story here was about somebody who was too quick to sort of tweet out a reply. The story was that a customer went to this man's restaurant, I don't know, I think it was Thanksgiving evening, and something, like they hated the pumpkin pie, and tweeted it out like right before they left the restaurant, and somehow he caught wind of it and sent some nasty replies back to her. Well, long story short was it was like a big blow up, and the public found out about it very quickly, and the restaurant was shut down in a matter of months. So, here's my sketch, here's my rough sketch, and I have to say that the first couple times you do a drawing for somebody and you think, oh, I'm sending this drawing to an art director. They're going to be like really critical of my work, and they're going to, I'm really embarrassed about showing this to them. I think I lost that early on, and I realized that it's not about the quality of the sketch. It's really about, in a couple of lines, communicating the idea, and to kind of get over your abilities or lack of ability to draw clearly, I think. And to be honest with you, I think that sketching is a really good exercise regardless of the kind of work you're involved in. Personally, I find taking a sheet of paper, I wish I brought one of those with me, but I just take a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, I divide it up in quadrants, and I start drawing. Because I think what I realized is that, okay, the drawing's not as precious if I'm only occupying a quarter of the page, and I can do a bunch of them and turn it over and do a bunch more. But getting your idea down, that I'm trying to think what it is. It's I learned this expression from my kids. It's basically this muscle memory. When you take pen to paper and do the drawing, it sort of helps you, I think, in the process of refining your idea. And I think that's true of whether it's a portrait or a landscape or a still life photograph. I find it very, very helpful. I didn't bring the photograph this was for, but just to give you an idea of the sketching. And I would sort of talk about what the background would be, how this image was going to be on an X-ray monitor. And so I use this, just as a way to communicate in a simple way to the client about what I'm thinking about doing. Here's some that I really liked, but never, the client never liked them. It was all about like immunotherapy, and I just thought the letter I was a sort of strong graphic thing, but you can't hold on to your ideas forever, and I did 3 or 4 or 5 drawings. I sent them to the client, and it was, no, we have our idea that we want. And I found that, to be honest, a lot of times people would like your opinion. They don't always, they don't always take it. But again, the exercise of doing the drawing, sending it, I think, can be very helpful to both parties. This is one I did for Smithsonian Magazine. every year they do an issue that where they give out awards to 10 scientists, writers, people in the arts who basically are, I think they're the ingenuity awards, so who convey some sort of ingenuity in their field. And again, working with my same model maker, Kelly Murphy, prop stylist, you know, she took the armature wire as this very flexible aluminum wire that sculptors often use as the base of a work, and sculpted the brain. I don't remember if we did a sketch, you know, in advance. We used some LED lights and sparklers. It was pretty straightforward. Often these days, a client will ask to take an image, not really animate them, but I often give them maybe 8 or 10 additional frames so that they can use a simple animation on their website. This was also for Smithsonian. You know, I think I've learned so much from my assistant, from my retoucher, from all the people I collaborate with over the years. I thought this was really brilliant. This was, you know, we had gotten a high-res photograph from the client, from Smithsonian, and Kelly, my model maker, made this genius sign. We made it about 3 feet across, and that's a lot of the conversation sometimes is, how big do you make a prop? And there's a certain scale that's necessary to make it convincing. If it's too small, the detail is lost. You know, if it's too big, it's too time-consuming for the model maker to work with. So we had a sign that was about 4 feet across, and then my assistant made that funny little necklace, I thought, which was like great, you know, just turning it into that great, like I don't know, piece of jewelry. But of course, it was too risky for the Smithsonian, so that's how the cover ran. Another one for them, title was Hardwired for Love. And I think sometimes these things, you know, look very simple and straightforward, but just the act of interweaving the wires and making a structure was very, very time-consuming for her. Things I think often seem to go in threes. This was for it's either the Boston Magazine or Boston Globe, and it was a story about these naval bases around the state. And so my model maker, you know, made this map. She designed the legend that would be the word Massachusetts and the names of those bases underneath. She sourced the props. You know, I had the background, and you know, we worked on the composition together. So shortly after that, we did this one for Newsweek, which also was about, somehow seemed to have the same motif. And I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was about funding a particular plane or missile system. And quite often, I think some of the best promotion are pictures like this, which I think are kind of clever. Sometimes my idea, sometimes the client's idea, but often people see them and want you to recreate an image in a similar vein. For this one, which looks pretty straightforward, we took that same idea of the framework of a model. The guys know this. I'm assuming everybody knows what this is. It's like a toy model kit, and these are the pieces inside. But for the parts, we went to a factory in Massachusetts that makes car kits. And so we photographed all of these car parts, life-size, there, and came back to the studio and composited them together. And I really love the layout. I thought the layout was just great, really great. And then another one we did for fun for the Super Bowl. So a lot of times, you know, during our downtime, Kelly, my model maker, and I just, you know, brainstorm different things. I don't really remember how we came up with the what's the name of the, anybody know the name of the chart where you do reflexology? Yeah, reflexology chart. And I just thought, we thought about making it out of sponges. And I think, a lot of times and I'm borrowing someone else's, great line, which is we take pictures to see what happens when we take pictures. We talk about an idea, we make the photograph, we see where it goes. We don't always know, and, we're often interested by the results. Kelly's father had just passed away in the Midwest, and she came back, and somehow we got to talking that he had a big collection of tools, and he always had a lot of duct tape around. So we just got this idea to make a heart out of, aluminum duct tape. Another Kelly prop, the nest, that is. I think this was about, this was for another health-related story, and I think it was about that each of these foods has a certain, acidity or basic kind of quality, and I think the colors were there to reflect that. There was some kind of a diet where you balanced the pH of the foods you were eating. Another one just for fun. And I think model makers, just so you know, are people who are big collectors. And in her inventory, Kelly has lots of boxes of fabric and parts and all kinds of stuff that we draw on. This was a series for Wired in the UK. It was about weapons that you can make from items in the gift shop, believe it or not. So this was actually a crossbow that you could make from an umbrella and I think a rolled up newspaper, and that's a handle from a suitcase. This was a little cannon that was, I can't remember what it's powered by, but if there are some videos online that show you how far this thing can really shoot. It's amazing. This was a story for Consumer Reports magazine about, data theft. And then, I don't think of myself as a food photographer, but I think that I've had some interesting assignments over the years that tend to be more, more graphic, more, I guess, sort of concept-driven, less about, a specific recipe. This was a story for the World Wildlife Fund. It was about how the habitat of this Siberian tiger is being destroyed by the harvesting of pine nuts. So first, and part of the process was finding the right photograph of the tiger and then doing sketches of it. And in fact, what we really did, or what Kelly had done, was she toasted the pine nuts to different degrees so that we could create the shading in the model. We figured out, let's see, what was the solution? The solution was that, you've got this big sheet of white, and how do you make this, how do you make this thing without seeing the outline of it? And so I think we talked about it a lot, and it wound up being that we made, because a bunch of us had to do it to get through the day, we made little tiny pinholes, which were the shape of the tiger, so that we could kind of build the tiger over time, and you really wouldn't see the outline of it. And of course, in the video, that gets to be blurred. But I'm really thrilled with how it turned out in the magazine as well. I can't remember who this was for, but it was something that was a combination of things where It's, I think it was the ESPN magazine, and it was about the redesign of this football trophy. And so the structure of the trophy we photographed on location, and then the shards of glass, which the previous trophy was made out of, we did in the studio and combined them. Still life, you know, was a lot about rigging, balancing things in the studio, combining them together. This was really an assignment. This was for a magazine that goes to people who are insured through USAA, which is, I guess, if you've served in the military, you can buy insurance through this company. And I don't remember this specific image or what this was, but I liked the solution to it a lot. This was for Money magazine. This was Fortune. I like to think that, you know, a lot of my work holds together stylistically, but I really like the challenge of the assignment. So I don't know that this looks like any of my other pictures, but it was all about a light festival taking place in Atlanta, and this was for the Southwest Airlines magazine, and we just got to play with light. And what could be more fun than that? And there was another picture that involved a portrait of a musician who was performing at the festival that we wrapped the light around as well. This is for Golf magazine. This story is about how minorities are sort of underrepresented when it comes to pharmaceutical research. And I think it's because of the other map pictures that we had that the client decided, okay, we could, you know, let's take that one step further and apply it to this story. So I think I've noticed lately that happens a lot. We see another picture in your portfolio. I think it would be a good fit for your story. This was for AARP, a story about blood pressure medications. And one of the hospital magazines about, you know, story about memory loss. This was the Wall Street Journal. It was like a series of pictures. It was about how the political parties are crumbling. And so Kelly baked maybe 15 cookies that were both, you know, the mule and the elephant. And don't you know that the client was really critical of the donkey and how if it was a really good read, and it actually much more challenging than I would have guessed. This was a recent one for the World Wildlife Fund. Again, also, this was about Walmart's efforts to reduce their packaging waste. And so we were looking for recyclable packaging, which is not the easiest thing to do. But the thing that holds up the headphones is made out of recycled paper. Same thing here, same story, but talking about the food industry and paper products as well. Yeah, this in particular, this was more easily achieved in Photoshop. It would have had to have a really big studio to be able to make this happen in one picture. And I think also the beauty of it is it gives us a little more control in the end. That, you know, ultimately the client wanted the look of a conveyor belt, and we photographed maybe 4 different kinds of milk bottles. You know, at the end, it's just inevitable that you find that people change their mind, and I might have an art director who I'm working with, and they present the image to their editors, or in this case, the editors at the the World Wildlife Fund, and they might have a different opinion. So we often have to build in the ability to go back and rework the composition. This was a recent one I did for Smithsonian about the future of beer. I decided I wasn't going to do 1 million drawings. I did 3 drawings, and they had me photograph 2 out of the 3. That's how basic it gets, that drawing. And so this was one experiment, and this was one of the photographs they used, and this was another one. So we'll go back to the mid-90s, and if I really think about my career, I think it has to do with a lot of trust, having a small number of clients who have a certain amount of trust with your ability. And I had a client, really great graphic designer named Michael McGinn, who was with a company called Design Frame. And we had been doing some promotions and advertising for paper companies in the past. And one day he called me up and he said, we're doing this campaign for Strathmore Paper, and the idea is that we want to create a series of photographs of briefcases going through the X-ray machine at the airport. Is that something you could do? And I don't know if he knew that I love technology, or that he knew that my uncle, was a medical doctor who had a patent for, in the X-ray field. But somehow I said, I don't know. Let me see. Give me a couple weeks, and I'll see what's possible. So I knew a lot of people in the medical field, and I thought about going to a doctor's office or a hospital, and I realized, patients came first. So I figured there must be other places to take X-ray images out there. So I found an industrial X-ray lab, and that's what we did. And we photographed all of these elements, which we put together in this series of ads for Strathmore Paper. I think unlike a conventional still life photograph where you have a lot of props that you pull from to make a composition, in the kinds of X-ray pictures that I make, quite often I'll X-ray 10 or 15 or 20 things, come back and look at them, and then decide, oh, this would look good in the composition. So typically it's done digitally, and seeing which elements interact better with others. And in a way it was like the best promotion ever. I've over the years spent money making postcards and paying to be in certain promotional directories, but it was a kind of a unique approach, and so somehow people found out about it and they'd call me. And so shortly after that I did this. It wasn't really an ad, it was just the hang tag that was on the back of a pair of jeans or Docker's pants. And the feature of Docker's pants at the time was that they had all of these inner pockets, and they wanted me to be able to put together an image that reflected that. As much as I've loved taking conventional still life photographs, seeing these beautiful textures unfold in X-rays has been a real treat. And I think in a lot of ways it harkens back to me as an 8-year-old developing my first roll of film and making prints, because there is that magic of seeing a sheet of film, and I still do use X-ray film. I just wanted to talk about this one for a minute. I was really excited by how this turned out. And so I was so excited that I sent emails out to my clients, and without thinking that the picture had been used yet by the magazine. And I got a couple of kind of angry phone calls, and that was a no-no, because I did it for them and they wanted to be the first to reveal it to their audience. So it was I haven't done that since. This was an ad that I did for Hewlett-Packard, and it involved a lot of different pieces. There's the Chinese food, there's the copier, there's all of the elements that you see inside. We were a combination of conventional photographs and X-rays, and it was, it was quite an ordeal. I don't think I did this for anybody. I think it really was just for fun. This was for an annual report for a company that makes, not the containers, but makes all those little pump sprayers that are, in every kind of, lotion and spray bottle. I learned a long time ago that I couldn't, like at will, have somebody go to the doctor and be x-rayed. It's something that has to be medically indicated in order for a doctor to offer an x-ray. So over the years, when my various family members have had sprains and breaks and things, I've saved those x-rays and put them to good use. I had a couple Christmases ago, I had somebody call me in November and ask if I would take an x-ray portrait of his family, and I had to explain to him that that's really against the law.
Do you ever use like a skeleton or like a fake model of like a fake person?
Repeat the question. Yeah, the question was, have ever I used a skeleton? I have. Okay, so there are a couple of issues in this day and age, which is that really the only thing that we can obtain is a plastic skeleton. So there probably was a time when you were allowed to own a skeleton made out of bones, and probably if you were in medical college, if you were in school, you could probably get access to one. But right now, I can't get access to it. I've tried. I've used some of the bones, but they just have a very different composition, than real bones do. This was done for the British edition of GQ recently. And I'd be the first to admit that I've built this library of images over the years that I just have to kind of pull up from time to time when somebody says, oh, I really, I want you to do a suitcase from the 1960s. Well, I might have to go and find, my prop stylist might have to go and find that suitcase to get the right time period, but I might have already taken a photograph of a syringe or a pair of sunglasses that I'll, press into service. The other thing that I learned early on is that while we see images at the airport in color, it's really just software that is arbitrarily applying color to the image, that all x-rays are basically black and white, and the software decides, oh, this is going to be green or this is going to be pink. So it's not an indication of anything, any special property of the subject. I did this originally for an advertising agency in New Jersey. The client, asked me if I would ask the models if they'd be willing to be x-rayed. 17 out of 21 models agreed to be x-rayed, and I had to, I just really had to explain to them that it's not, I just can't do it. So press those family members' bones into service. And I do, relicense photographs sometimes through stock libraries, sometimes just directly. I've learned which materials over the years x-ray better than others. I know that paper is not a particularly opaque, is not a material that the x-ray sees very clearly, so sometimes I'll have to kind of cheat a little bit and fake that part of the image. How I choose the color, it's really very arbitrary, but I will say that when you look at a piece of x-ray film, there's a kind of a very pale blue cast to it. So for me, I think of that as the dominant color in an x-ray. This is a great story. There was a client who asked a stockbroker if they would smuggle these diamonds into the country for them, and the story goes on to say how eventually they were caught, and I don't think it was through the X-ray exactly, but it was my job to kind of figure out how to illustrate that. Here I got a scale model of a tooth that was about 1 foot high, because I knew it would have nicer reveals. I knew that a little tiny tooth wouldn't have a whole lot of detail. So it's a matter of thinking about the scale, thinking about what kinds of textures I might hope to find inside the subject. I like a lot of these objects from the 1950s and 60s. I guess the sort of internal workings, the sort of pre-electronic era, seeing the switches and some of the other details that, we don't see in a lot of more current technology. You can see that a lot of these elements, keep coming back in. I think that foot got used, 4 or 5 times before. There are a couple other people, around the world who do X-rays. I can't say there are, a huge number of us, but there have been a number of people who were radiologists who made a lot of beautiful images of flowers. And I haven't done a lot of it. It really requires different equipment than I have access to, but I'd like to do more of it. This was a story for, let's see, I don't know, can anybody read that? I'm trying to think. It's one of the sporting magazines. But basically I was on call. I was waiting to find out if the editor had caught this bass. So it was kind of like, if he caught the bass, I'd get the job. So he caught the bass, brought it, to me, or we met at the X-ray lab. I X-rayed that. I X-rayed that lure that you see in the lower right corner. And of course, again, I needed to have them as separate elements so that I could control the interaction between the two objects and the opacity of how they work. This story was about how spouses, lie to one another. You see in the grocery bag on the top, when you walk in, you see the fruit and the eggs, but yet, they've been out shopping. And conversely, the husband who's been gambling and hiding the winnings in the bottom of the golf bag. I think this was probably one of the most complex ones I've done to date. It was for a campaign for Georgia Power and Light about energy-saving appliances. And so in the theme of the ad, you saw certain areas that were called out in red. But each of these elements were X-rayed separately and put together. And just so you know, basically in the X-ray process, everything is like a contact sheet. So the film is 14 by 17 inches, and I put the object down on a piece of 14 by 17 inch film and make a picture. So the door on the right took up about 8 or 12 different images, X-ray images, that my retoucher had to combine together and retouch out the seams. But it was fun. And this is how they appeared. This was for an ad for a feminine hygiene product, just for fun. This series was for an organization that sets engineering standards throughout the country or throughout the world, and these images were to decorate the lobby of their offices in Park Avenue South. So they were about 60-inch square Duratrans prints. So this is me in the glamorous X-ray lab. So what I'm holding is the X-ray source. The X-ray source is basically, they call it the camera, but to me the X-ray source is the light. The light is being projected through the camera that I have laying down on a sheet of X-ray film. I'm not standing in the room when the X-ray is made. I position it. It's a very heavily regulated field. I'm allowed to do certain things, but somebody who's a licensed technician who spent years getting their certification has to be the one to make the image. For the first few years I did this, it scared the hell out of me. It's just, it's very dangerous technology. There's like 100,000 volts of electricity that goes through this tube, and in addition, there are these yellow hoses that you see on the ground, and that is the controls for a radioactive isotope that's often used to X-ray very heavy metal products. So it's it's dangerous business, but in the hands of a skilled laboratory, it's I don't fear for my life the way I used to at the beginning. And so this is the raw X-ray as it came out and as it was processed, and then we'll bring it back to the studio and scan it and sometimes combine a couple of exposures into something like that. These were for Popular Photography magazine. Earlier I mentioned that I've been up to the MIT Media Lab. This is the most current iteration of the biomechatronic legs. So what you're seeing is electrical motors in the ankle and a kind of computer brain in the back of the calf that controls this limb. And I often just bring extra things, with me to the lab if I have the time. I just want to see what's going to happen. And this was an image that I did a couple years ago, and that I sort of recently found and processed, and I just sort of love the overlapping and the intersection of the buttons and the seams. A lot of pictures of handbags. This was for Time magazine, a story about concealed carry. This bag was made by a company called Pistol Packin' Mamas, and what you're actually seeing is the holster that's permanently attached to the interior of the handbag. Anybody? Porta potty, yes, it is a porta potty. People want X-rays of porta potties too. I like how minimalist this was. Just the grids and the knobs from the stove and the spatula. Here I combined, one of the existing X-rays that I had of the hand with still life photograph of hand model, as well as some stock imagery of these this sort of lightning and neurons, and that's it. You're welcome.
You suspend a lot of objects that you take photographs of, and I was just wondering, what kind of apparatus are you suspending them from, and then are you using like fishing line, or like what are you using
Exactly.
to suspend?
Do you know what a C-stand is?
No.
The C-stand is, that's just like, it came from the company, like Century Stand. It's a heavy steel stand that has, 3 legs. It's a light stand, but it's grip equipment, things that were designed for film that you can support a lot of weight on. So usually you hoist those over the set with fishing line or that metal armature wire that I showed you that the brain was made out of, and retouch those out. A lot of times, you'll hear the expression used a lot now in terms of retouching, where people will say, give me some extra plates. And so usually what that means is we'll take a separate photograph of the background, apart from the subject, so that if in retouching, there's something that we need to remove, we have a clean image of the background that we can go back and replace the image with. But a lot of fishing line, for sure, a lot.
So a few times you mentioned that you had your portfolio was seen by somebody.
Yes.
And that I'm sure people would know, well, what does that mean? And how do you get your portfolio seen by somebody?
Okay. Well, I think that process has changed somewhat. When I first started, it was a little bit easier to call people up and go see them. Yeah. And I think people, to a T, are stretched very thin. And when I do get a chance to talk to photo editors at events that are organized by professional groups and by private groups, people who arrange to have art buyers and photo editors come along, when I ask photo editors, they say, I say, what's your biggest challenge these days? They all say, to a T, say that they're stretched too thin, because previously they were responsible for editing the photographs for the print edition, and now they have to edit the photographs for the online edition, and then sometimes there's yet another media outlet. So I think it's more difficult to see people. I think, I don't know if you're familiar with professional groups, but ASMP, American Society of Media Photographers, has an annual event in New York and in other cities. APA, Advertising Photographers of America, has similar events. I'm sure there are other groups that do have these events where they invite industry people there to show your work too. There's also Photo Plus, which happens in October at the Javits Center, and a couple of different organizations also host events there. And I find that that's one of the best ways to meet photo editors, because a lot of people are congregating. These events are set up so that you get 15 minutes, which is more than enough. You bring a printed portfolio, you bring an iPad, and you get to share your work. And I find that that's the current state of affairs of how to meet people in the industry, for sure.
An extension of that question is, do you use mailings to promote the work, or do you rely more on social media these days?
Well, I've never stopped doing mailings over the years. More recently, I've done little booklets where I've printed maybe a 6-inch square booklet that has maybe 8 or 10 images that I send out. To varying degrees of success. I think the great quote from John Wanamaker, who was the person who founded the department store where Bed Bath & Beyond is on 6th Avenue, was 50% of all the money I spend on advertising is wasted. He said, the problem is I just don't know which 50%. And so I think as a photographer, I've tried postcards, I've tried ads in source books, I've tried these one-on-one meetings, and so I continue to do them. If they have had success, I'm not sure. But actually, I will say that mailing to the people who I've worked with in the past has been the most successful. I tend to want to think that if I send out 1,000 postcards to people I've never met, that there's 1,000 people who get to know me. But the reality is the most success out of those mailings are the people who I've already worked with, who I am basically reminding that, oh, gee, I've done something new, I'd like to share this with you. So while I now send email blasts and try to massage social media, mailing and being in touch with, long-term clients is still a valuable resource. as valuable as ever.
What do you like dream about X-raying next?
Well, I think because I haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of like plant life, I want to do it, and every time it comes up, I'm a little stymied. So I hope I have some downtime. I've sort of found a source recently of where I could go and do that, and that's been a little bit of the challenge. And so I hope to do more living things, hopefully not people, but objects from nature, I think, is what interests me at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.